Welcome back, and this will be the third tutorial for Curves to Mesh. Today I'm going to talk about all the settings on the side of the Curves to Mesh panel in more detail now. I'm also going to talk about some of the edge cases you might encounter when using Curves to Mesh to create shapes. And then I'm going to go and use the car file to talk about some of the more detailed shapes that you can create and where I think Curves to Mesh will be useful and where I think Blender's other modeling tools will complement it, and vice versa as well. So with that, what I'll do is I'll just delete the default cube. I'll add a standard 2x2 Bezier patch, which is part of the add-on. And so remember from last time, this is not actually a mesh that I've added here. It's actually a set of 4 curves. So this is the structure of the curves here. So if I select one by hitting the L key, you can see that happening there. So I'll just also switch on normal, being able to view the normals as well here, so that you can see the curves more clearly. So if I select these control handles here and hit G and Z, you'll see the curves moving in that direction here. So I'm just going to go through some of the other settings that are available for Curves to Mesh. So if I go to the Curves to Mesh panel and I click Enable, you'll see a preview of the mesh that's going to be created, as I've talked about before. And there's a few settings to talk about here. So the first setting is that the collection to operate on. So by default, Curves to Mesh will operate on all the curves under the default collection, which is simply called collection. So if I were to create a new collection here and call it curves, and I would change this selection to curves, you'll see that it's disappeared, and that's because it's only operating on the curves collection, and it doesn't have any curves inside. So if I were to click and just drag this curve into that collection and then click Enable, you'll see that happen, and hopefully that's useful for when you're organizing quite a big file with lots of curves and you want to switch on and off which curves you want to be operating on. There's nothing stopping you having multiple collections on here, but you'll always operate on one set of curves at a time. The other thing to talk about is the conversion method. So by default, and the main thing I'm talking about here is the conversion method of the curves surface to mesh. So this is where it takes a set of 4 curves arranged in kind of square patches and then fills in the blanks with a grid fill operation in the background. So if I were to just delete that curve and add, let's add something a little bit more interesting. So another way of having more interesting curves is if you go to the add-on tab and you type, I think probably extra, yeah, add curves extra objects is the add-on you want, and that's bundled in with Blender. So if I activate that and now hit the add button, you'll see lots of other curves at your command. So the what I'll do is I'll add, well, let's just add something still fairly simple like a polygon curve, and let's set the number to something a little high. So this is just a standard curve. So there's a few things that you want to do before Curves to Mesh will operate on it, because Curves to Mesh will only work on Bezier type curves. So if I go to the Data Properties tab here on the right hand side, Object Data Properties, then it's always best to convert the shape from a 2D shape to a 3D shape, and you'll see that the filled hole disappear here. If I'm in edit mode by hitting tab, I need to make sure that these are all converted into Bezier curves. So if I click enable now, nothing will happen, or nothing might happen with the curve as it is. So just to be sure, I set spline type to Bezier, make sure all those curves are selected when I do it. So that's just a tip on how to get more sophisticated curves in Blender. By default, as I was saying, it's on this surface to mesh conversion method here. But there is another option here of how to convert curves, which are more in, it will convert profiles of curves into a mesh. So if I take this curve here and duplicate it by hitting D, you'll see that it's actually creating, it's taking two curve profiles and it's adding them there. So if I just move that to the top, what it does is it interpolates between the two. So if I rotate that, let's rotate that around, you can see that it'll move around with the curve. So you can see this. See also that by default, what curves to mesh will do, it will try and snap the nearest set of vertices to a corner point of the curve. And if you don't want that on, you can disable that in the Advanced tab by clicking Snap to Control Point, and that will actually give you a smoother result, but with less detail. And if you do want to give it more detail, that brings me on to the more of the settings here, where we talk about profile subdivisions, and this is just going to tell Curves to Mesh to create more detail, more subdivisions in between these curves. So if I increase the curve subdivisions here, you can see that there's a little bit more detail being added there, and that's the curve subdivisions, and also the bridging subdivisions can be changed here. So hopefully that's going to be quite useful for you. So I'll just delete this top curve as well, and you can see that it's operating on both these curves because they're within that collection I created. I'll just delete that for now, and I'll just add that standard 2x2 Bezier curve object that I had from before, and I'll click enable, and that will look a bit strange to start with because I've still got it on this conversion method. But if you click surface to mesh here, you can see those subdivisions working in the surface to mesh way as well. So here the settings have actually changed a little so that the subdivisions are actually across and down. So if I set those back to their defaults, which is 10 by 10, you can see that the subdivisions have been cut along by a standard number of times. But if you change, say, you might wish to change the subdivisions across or the subdivisions down, any way you like. So that's that. So the next settings that I'll talk about, and this is where we talk about some of the more nuanced situations you might find yourself in when you're creating some of these shapes, is the need to check the direction of the curve. So but by the direction of the curve, I mean, so if I tab in to the curves here, you'll see that each of these curves has a direction, and this direction flows around in a loop. And it's a little hidden in 3D applications, but loops are quite important in modeling a mesh and showing it in a straight way, because it tells the 3D application which directions the faces should be organized in. So that helps when you get into some strange cases such as this. So I'm going to open another scene now just to show you that in action. So if I click open here, and I'll go to my examples directory. Yeah, and I've opened a test file that I've created to show this in action. So what I've done here is I've created a set of curves that kind of show a kind of flattened circular shape, and I just want to fill the outer ring a bit like a flattened donut, and I don't want to fill the middle. So by default, checking the direction of curves is off. So if I click on enable on this now, it's gonna create a bit of a mess really, because you can see here there's kind of lots of overlapping lines and curves, and if I click create mesh now, you'll see it's a bit of an overlapping shape. It's created overlapping faces on it. And what's happened there is if I delete that mesh, because I've still got the curves here still, you can see that the curves that I've arranged here, so are kind of segments in that kind of 4x4 fashion. But what the add-on needs to do is, and what it does in the background is it looks at each of these and it organizes these into groups of curves that are connected to one another in groups of 4 to create those patches. But if you look around the outside, what we've got as well is one curve, 2, 3, 4, and that actually will fill in all of the mesh by default, because it doesn't really know it doesn't really know any more information about grouping. So it will group these into 4, but it will also group the whole circle into 4, and it will group the inner circles into 4 as well, because 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I click enable there, it's still a mess. But if I check this surface creation option here and click check direction of curve, you'll get the result that you're after in these situations, because what it's doing here is, as well as looking at the 4x4, the quad patches, it will also be looking at the direction that these curves are flowing in, and when it sees the curves flowing in the right direction all the way around in a loop, 1, 2, 3, 4, it will say, that is something I want to fill. What it won't fill are any curves that might be in a group of 4, like 1, 2, 3, 4, but the direction of the curves are not going the right way, so it will ignore that. And that actually comes in quite handy if you want to create something a little bit more nuanced. I mean, a lot more nuanced than a simple circle that you could create much more easily in using other tools in Blender. But perhaps if you were creating a machine pass, and I've seen other users do this sort of thing, where they want to create these sorts of shapes, and they start getting faces that are filled in otherwise. So that's an option there. Well, I'll show you this in a slightly more practical case of a cylinder that's not flattened. So if I click cylinder here, you can see that if I've got check direction on curves on, it will show a nice a nice loop, but if I check that off, it also fills the top and the bottom, which you may want, but the option's there to give that bit more fine-grained control if you wish. It's worth saying as well about how I actually change the direction of these curves. So I'll just hit the L key on one of these control handles and I'll get the curve that's linked here. And just changing the direction is fairly straightforward. So once you've got a curve segment here, you can go to the segments submenu, here, and simply click switch direction. And you can see that curve has now switched direction, and you can see the add-on in action there, because it doesn't recognize this as a patch anymore. It doesn't see that square, and that's how you set the direction of a curve. So what I'll do now is I'll open up a far more interesting file. I promise you now that enough of creating quite dull shapes. So if I open the car example here, and this is all bundled with the add-on as well. So if I go down here, so there's the car curve which comes here. So this is a sports car. It's all being created using curves. So if I select and tab that, you can see that this is a network of curve patches, as I call them, which are all set up to fill in all the surfaces. So if I click enable here, you'll see that in action. I can also talk about the rest of the settings a bit here as well. So here you go. There's a few things worth talking about here. Before I talk about the settings, I'll talk about how this might fit in with your workflow. I mean, it's up to you how much you want to use Curves to Mesh. I've seen some people model entire 3D models exclusively using these curves, and in my experience, I'd say that I'd recommend that you should use a mixture of more traditional modeling tools in Blender along with Curves to Mesh. So I'd use Curves to Mesh to perhaps model some trickier shapes that you're finding difficult to create otherwise, using 3D modeling extrusions and manipulating vertices and those sorts of things that you're finding quite tricky to do. But I wouldn't use Curves to Mesh to model every single detail. So I've got this to kind of a healthy level of detail here. So if I click create mesh now, and it will think about it for a little bit, because this is kind of it's got lots of curves in it, and you'll see the shape here. And I could go on and model the detail of, say, the windshield or the lights here using Curves to Mesh, but there's probably a point where it's going to become a lot faster to use say the standard extrude tools in Blender, which are very powerful. So here, I'm just hitting I and E to create more detail in the lights, and so on and so forth. So whenever people are going the full hog, as it were, and using this as sort of a replacement to Rhino and stuff, I think it can get so far, but I would say at some point, I think trying to make it do everything is extremely ambitious, and maybe there's a bigger project in it. maybe maybe there's some funding. I'd have to get there to really make this into a competitor to some of the top CAD modeling tools out there. Anyway, there we go. There's me off my soapbox. So we'll just delete that, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the options. And some people ask sort of how I modeled this. So I used some reference models. I also used some profile images. So you know, I put Blender into top mode and started to sketch out the outline shapes of the car, and so on and so forth. I suppose again, the tops and the sides where there's kind of broad shapes, those are quite straightforward. It started to get a little difficult. See around the front bumper. If I click enable here again, you'll see that there's like an inset on the front grille, and you could in normal modeling tools that would be quite easy. You just kind of extrude in, and I did take some time there, and that was where I just kind of decided, well, I think I'm at my limit now. I'll convert it to a normal mesh and carry on modeling it in Blender when I'm happy with the overall shape. There's that. I'll talk about some of the other settings here, because you can see that there's the shape. I haven't created all the curves on just on the one side of the mesh. So if I disable again, it actually has a mirror modifier applied. So if I click enable on that, you can see that if I uncheck the mirror option, it will show you that it's only doing one side. So you can work in a kind of a mirror mode in Curves to Mesh. And these curves simply have a mirror modifier applied on it. So if I were to switch that off, you can just see that that's one side of the car. So it's worth saying that the mirror modifier on the curves is separate from the mirror modifier that will be created in the preview mode. So if I click Mirror X again and wait a moment, you'll see there that it's mirroring the shape that I make. So there's some mirror options here. There's also tools to flip the normal, so flip the direction of the surface. So sometimes you'd want to create a shape that's the inside itself. So normals are all about the direction of the faces, which direction the faces will go. You can turn off and on smooth shading. So if I uncheck that, you won't see anything change here, but when I create the mesh, here it's got the smooth shading is off, so you can see that there's no graduation between the surfaces here. If I delete that again and go back and enable again, you can also see that when I create the mesh. So if I create mesh from that, so you can also see that when I create this mesh, and I decided to leave this on as an option as well, that it has all the lines displayed, and that's just this display preference that I've checked here, saying show wire and show all the edges. So if I uncheck that, delete the mesh and run it again, it's actually create the same object, but the display settings have the wire off, and that's simply a matter of preference on the object display that you can switch on and off the wireframe mode. And there you go. So the last thing I'll talk about is the advanced settings, and I'm not really going to talk about them a lot really, because you should hardly need to change them. There is the snap to control point checkbox, which I showed earlier, which is all about making sure that the nearest vertices that are created to a control point are actually snapped to it. You might be able to see that in this section here. If I uncheck that, you'll see that it actually hasn't snapped those control points there to that little bit of detail. So that might be something that you want to disable. And the rest of the settings I'm really not going to show you, because it's very difficult to show you actually. This is all the nudges and the samples and the definition are all about how the add-on works out how to distribute these points along the curve, and you really don't need to touch those at all. Neither should you have to touch curve connections either, because that is again more to do about how closely a curve point needs to be next to another curve point to form a patch. But I find in practice that this setting never gets changed, so I just keep that minimized for now, and I've noticed that sometimes if people run into trouble, it's because one of these settings has ended up for whatever reason being changed. So I leave those alone, and in a future version I might even put them in the preferences panel and hide them away a little bit more. And that's about it really. So I had a request to show the animation nodes version of this add-on as well, and that's all about having a more a workflow where you could go back and forth a lot more. So because unfortunately we don't have the ability to make this a modifier in Blender, have it sort of, you have to kind of, it's a one-way street in a way, because you have to create the mesh, and although the curves don't get deleted or anything, you can't kind of alter a curve and have it have the mesh react accordingly. So I can't say select, so I'm selecting the curve point here, and if I wanted to kind of move that up, the mesh doesn't react, and unfortunately that's because you can't build this in as a modifier in Blender, unfortunately. So again, that kind of supports that workflow I talked about, where you want to get this to a certain point where you're happy with it, and then use Blender's more traditional modeling tools. But what animation nodes at least does give you is the ability, much like kind of cycles nodes, allows you to change textures, and they're not set in stone. Animation nodes allows you to have a set of curves, and when you move those curves, the mesh will also move. But I'll talk about that in the next video. So I hope that's kind of debunked some of the questions you've had about curves to mesh. This is certainly a result of some of the questions I've got from users who are both either new to Blender or certainly new to the curves to mesh add-on, where I've seen kind of common challenges that users come across. So I hope that's helped. And if you like this, please click a like, as they say, so that not only does it help the channel, but it also helps me know what's good and what's not so good on the channel. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.